Hi everyone, in this video I'm going to show you how to paint watercolor daisies. Daisies are one of the birth month flowers for the month of April, and I cannot wait to show you how I painted these. For this project I will only be using a size 4 round brush. I have my Arches 140 pound cold press watercolor paper, and I'm also using my limited palette of colors. This is cad yellow, magenta, cerulean, indigo, and sap green. For watercolor daisies, I like to start with the centers, and I'll show you why. So first we're going to start with a pure cad yellow circle for the center. I add a little bit of magenta into my yellow to get a more orangey mix, and then I tap that around the edges of the center while it's still wet to get a nice blend. Now we're going to paint our petals, and I'm going to use mostly indigo in a very light wash. You can add a little bit of magenta to create more of a lavender color, but the key is to make sure that the wash is very light. You've added a lot of water, and if you have too much water, because again you don't want it to be a blob, you can tap that on your paper towel. But the key is, if you do it fast enough, you should be able to get a blend from your yellow center, just a slight blend, into the petals. And I think this wide variety of colors and blends that you get makes painting white flowers so interesting. So I'm just slightly tapping to the center of the daisy, pulling with my size 4 round brush out until I get the petal shape that I want. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to use my size 4 round brush, is I think it makes the perfect petal shapes. And I like to pull from the center as much as possible instead of bringing the flower petal from the outer edge into the center, because I think it makes a better blend. But sometimes I will bring it in because painting on the complete opposite side of my right hand is trickier. But I love picking up different washes, tapping my brush, using more water to pull some of the center color out, and having that wide variety of blues and purples and yellows that are kind of mixing together to create a very reflective and glowy look for the white flower. Before everything has completely dried, I just tap in a little bit more of that orangey red color around the edge of the center, and then we're going to leave that to completely dry before we add more details later. That's how I would paint all daisies that are more open, where you're seeing the full center and a lot of the petals. I'm going to show you 4 ways to paint daisies in the different directions you can paint them. So up here on the top, we're painting a daisy that is more from the side, where the petals are drooping downward and the center's kind of domed up. And so we're doing the same steps as before. We have a bright yellow center, but it's more of a half circle, tapping in that reddish orange color around the edge, which is just that bottom line for this daisy. And then getting different washes of indigo. We need to make sure they're light again. We're going to tap into the center and pull out to create our petal shapes. When we're using colors to paint white petal shapes, it can be really confusing to our brain, especially when we're painting on white paper, because sometimes we'll paint a petal and it looks so dark and not real. But let it dry. Watercolor always dries lighter than you think it will, and the entire illusion will create the feeling of white petals. And having differences in value, some areas darker, some areas lighter, some areas with completely different colors, that's going to give us the feeling of glow and highlight and shadow within the white flower petals without having to do too much. But if you ever feel like you have put down too dark of a color, or it's just too intense for whatever reason, rinse your brush, tap it on a paper towel, and lift that color right out. It will most likely be the perfect color once you have lifted some of that pigment out, and then you can just leave it to dry. Now this center here is more of an odd shape, and I just wanted to make an odd shape of one that's, we're kind of seeing most of the flower, but it's kind of at the side, and we can create this looseness in the centers that really doesn't have to be an exact circle or half circle. And then when I'm painting the petals around it, I can play with perspective based on how long the petals are. So if the petals that are on the farthest side away from me, which is on the right side of the flower, are longer, and the petals over here on the left are shorter and squattier and more a triangle shape, then I get this perspective of I'm looking at the flower, but I'm looking at it from more of the side view. but I can see into the center. So it's just a nice way to create perspective in your flower petals. And while the petals are still wet, I can use a damp brush to take some of the color out and manipulate the values before it dries. Now, because our centers have dried, we're going to add a little bit more magenta into our yellow to get that deeper reddish orange color, and just start layering some of the texture into the centers around that edge, going a little bit up into the center, because it's all about layering these values. Once that dries, it will become a lot lighter and we can add a darker value later. Now again, I've picked up that super light wash of indigo, and using the shape of my brush, I'm going to paint a few petals that are pretty even in height, maybe a little bit tapered off at the end, maybe 4 petals that are just right next to each other. And I'm going to do 2 of these. And this is more a daisy that's not quite a bud, but it's in that beginning stages of forming, and pretty soon it's going to open up. So I just thought this was a fun way to create smaller flowers that are not quite buds, but they're not quite the big mommy flowers. Now we're going to mix up some sap green for the greenery. I love sap green, but I love adding some yellow into my sap green, especially for the first lighter wash. I also feel like that brighter yellow green complements daisies really well. One of my tricks for when you're painting flowers all together is paint one stem and then paint that flower's leaves so you know where they go. Then you can start layering the other flower's stems around it if they kind of get in the way. But something I used to do is I'd paint all the stems and then I would have no room for the leaves and it would look off. So I like to paint my stem and at least one leaf first and then move to the next stem. When I was looking at reference photos for daisies, a lot of the leaves were very smooth, but then a whole other group of them looked more like very jaggedy wildflowers. So I kind of ended up somewhere in the middle where I'm doing more of that simple leaf. Some edges are smooth, but then I wanted to give it some texture and personality and made the edge a little bit jagged. Another one of my favorite tips is to leave an area in the center of the leaves a little bit open so you can see the white paper underneath. This is just a great way to give dimension to a leaf, which can look very flat. So maintaining some of that white space, making the leaves more on the thin side, having some areas that are smoother and curved while some areas are jagged, and then I'm just going to keep it very simple. Make sure you're using the tip of your brush with light pressure, because you can always go back and add more substance to the stems or to the leaves, but it's really, really hard, if not impossible, to take it away. So sometimes I will do a very tiny stem. You can see here on this little bud, I did a tiny stem, and I go back and add some more to it later, but at least I know that it's small now. So to the bottom of those little baby flowers, we're just making kind of a scalloped edge in green and then connecting it to a stem. It's pretty straightforward. And then because I felt like I was playing with the balance of this entire piece, I liked the idea of some more scraggly, leafy texture that wasn't necessarily an exact leaf shape. One of my favorite concepts in art is that we don't have to paint exact leaf shapes when we're painting flowers. Because there are flowers and because there is green, our brain will connect that anything green around these flowers is a leaf or some kind of greenery. So we can make these kind of rough, jagged shapes that don't really have any leaf form, and it will look like a leaf. So once you've placed some of your main leaves, feel free to have some fun with the texture and the greenery and creating leaf blobs. And now that my greenery has mostly dried, we are going to add some indigo into our green mix and start creating cool shadow areas. Now this goes a long way. You do not need to be heavy-handed with this. Remember, we want our light, medium, and dark areas visible. We just need a tiny touch of this dark, shadowy color in a few well-placed areas. Think about where the light might be coming from. Think about where the flower might be casting a shadow on the stem or on the leaf. If the leaf is a little bit folded, there might be more shadow on the inside by that white space we left for the vein. So we're just adding a few places of this darker indigo green to create depth and contrast, but to not overtake the greenery. Because when we add this deeper contrast, it makes everything else pop out, especially our light white petals. Now, I think the flowers look really great as they are, but if you want to increase the dimension of your white flowers, what I'm going to do is get another wash of indigo, very light, just like in the beginning, but now we are going to layer it on top just in a few areas. We don't want to completely mimic all of the strokes we did before, but if we layer this same color on top of the daisy petals that we already had, we get this beautiful layered look. And with watercolor, because it's transparent, we can see the petals underneath. So if we do a light enough wash, we can just add a few areas of this blue lavender petal, and it layers and gives dimension and makes the flowers look very dynamic, because now we have a slightly deeper color, we have layers, we have dimension, and we can put this in, like I said, a few strategic areas so that it looks layered and dimensional without copying exactly what we did before. We don't want it to be all over the flower. I would just do it in a few places to give the idea of the depth that we're looking for without overwhelming the flower. Because sometimes we add the depth and the detail and the dimension and we lose our light areas. And I think the light areas are really important, even maybe more important than usual, because we're painting a white flower. We need those light areas to really stand out. Now we're going to mix up a deeper orange color. I had some brown on my palette that I mixed with some magenta and some green. So I'm mixing that in with my yellow to get a deeper brown color to really start getting lots of texture and shape to our centers. I think the key is going to be to make sure you are keeping a very significant part of your center bright yellow. And then to finish off the centers, I really needed a sharp dark value, and so to that orangey yellow I added some indigo, but it turned mostly green, so I just add some magenta because green and the pinks are across from each other on the color wheel. It'll get me to that deeper brown color that I'm looking for. And then same with that bluish green we added to the leaves, this darker deeper red brown color, we are going to add very tiny bits of it to the edge because it's just going to complete that dark feeling of shadow and contrast and depth, but we do not want it to take over. We want it to be very minimal. And that is it. One of the birth month flowers for April, the daisy, is finished, so I'm labeling that below. Please let me know if you have any questions down below. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. I know painting white flowers can be really tricky, but I hope this helped. I'll see you all in the next video. Bye guys.